What's going on, 3DMJers? Welcome back to another episode of the 3DMJ podcast. We are approaching the end of the season, the end of the year, and for many, they're going to be having their transition from contest prep to their recovery phase and then into the off season. And what a good time for our default diet course to have just come out recently. The reason why I created the default diet when I wrote this as a blog post back in 2019 was because it, just like the recovery diet, which is kind of a broader perspective look at all the various things you need to do to recover post-show, that's a little more quantitative, number-focused. As a theoretical rationale, we do talk through what you need to do, but one of the key components that I think supports that whole process's success is having habits and structure in place. And man, going back 10 years, we've talked about how as a bodybuilder becomes more ingrained in the lifestyle, not the numbers, but the structure of their contest prep and the structure of their off-season start to look more and more similar. And you know you're in your earlier phases of trying to figure out how to make this whole bodybuilding lifestyle sustainable when that statement kind of scares the crap out of you, or it sounds like, well, no way, or I wouldn't want to do that. So to clarify what I mean by that, I don't mean that you are on low calories or doing anything restrictive in the off season or not allowing yourself to live life or constantly focused on food, but more so that you have a sport supportive eating structure where you get up in the morning at a similar time and you eat at a similar time, and you do that throughout the day and around your training. And you kind of know from a plug and play qualitative look of your plate what's going to be happening. And you also know how to do things like, oh, I'm going to eat out, so I'll just swap out meal 3 with the decision I'm going to make at the store. At the restaurant. And then when I'm at the restaurant, I'm going to make a decision around my food that both satisfies my social needs, but also my sport needs, or at least it does in aggregate when I look at the whole day. So really, that's what we're going to be talking about today. I've got my fellow coaches, Coach Brad Loomis, Coach Alberto Nunez, who are surely dealing with this with a number of their athletes, have dealt with it themselves, and have a lot of input on this topic. In fact, a lot of their ideas informed the default diet course that's come out. So even though they're not directly in that course, if you want to check it out in the vault, their ideas absolutely contributed to it. And we're going to talk about the importance of it. And to kick it off, just to give an idea of anyone who hasn't taken the course, hasn't read the blog post, high-level overview of what it is and the way I structure it, but not necessarily the only way to structure it. We're going to talk about its main purpose. What I like to do is have a competitor think about their specific structure of their diet as how they lay out in contest prep in their lowest calorie phase on a low day, what their meal plan looks like and when they eat and what they eat from that perspective, because that should cover their bases for protein, fiber, a decent amount of fat intake, satiety-inducing foods, and it's often consisting of things like lean proteins, fibers, vegetables, and low-calorie fruits, and not much else unless they happen to be one of those blessed individuals who is able to still maintain a fair amount of starchy carbs and a little bit of fats because they just have a high activity level or high energy expenditure. And then from there, that is essentially the skeleton. And as you move into a refeed, you throw a little bit of meat on those bones, not literally, but figuratively, and that's in the form of carbohydrate. And then as you move into the off-season or the recovery phase, you're actually throwing some skin, some hair, and a little bit of body fat on that skeleton with meat, and that is in the form of added fats. And you're also allowing for a lot more flexibility because you have more metabolic, quote-unquote, capacity, if you will. Hey, you could swap out one of these more structured meals with eating out. And what this allows is that these processes become habits, and those habits support what you're attempting to do quantitatively and in terms of the actual goal outcome when you shift through these phases. And we've seen over the years that when these habits are not really habits, that they're not there, that's when, despite a good plan quantitatively, be it a recovery diet or a reverse diet, which, there's rarely a reason to do the first unless you have to compete the next year, which sometimes does happen based upon federation rules, does it go well? And your probability of success is much higher when you can simply fall back on certain behaviors. So anyway, I I want to kick this off by talking to my personal coach who's been helping me over the years, Alberto Nunez. He's got me less than 2 weeks out from Worlds. We're reversing up into the show, and my plan this offseason is to start my recovery phase with a little bit of a bump, but then being probably less aggressive than I was in 2019 and seeing if I could stay tighter in the offseason just because I noticed it wasn't as hard on the way down. I was still maintaining strength. Hell, I competed in the 83 kilo class and basically had increased my squat and deadlift after dieting down from 96, and only my bench press suffered largely because I was a smaller human, not because of any type of diet fatigue. So we're going to play around with a tighter offseason. To do that, I need this kind of structure. I need to not overshoot. And at this stage in my career, I'm actually 100% confident that that'll be a non-issue. And indeed, I think I'm at risk of maybe trying to stay too lean, which even if I was at risk of it theoretically on paper before, it never happened because I just kept eating. At least if we're talking 2009 and prior. And many competitors are going to find that's true for themselves. So, Berto, talk to me about when you find this set of habits to be most important, how you go about it, ingraining it in your athletes, how you communicate it, and how you view this whole schema of having a default diet and why it's useful.
One thing I want to add to what you said is that it doesn't necessarily have to be your contest prep. Like if you're that guy that's never had abs and like this was his diet when he finally got those abs, I guess to him that's going to be prep. Like that's his base default, just so that people who don't compete, it's like, hey, y'all need to be listening to this too. Because you only know what you know, right? Like, who knows? Like, for this guy, like, being 12% body fat might be, like, he might be feeling similar to the way you feel right now. Fat loss indeed is, like, exposure therapy, and I think that is a little bit of what we're seeing with you. This takes me back to your first contest prep. I think a few things. We have to make it clear that you were maybe too assertive. You were still really new to like being, I guess, this lean or being this lean with like that much muscle. Like that was a new world, a new experience for you. But I remember, and then, because I'm comparing it to my own experience. And mind you, I didn't get lean enough. Like I was 10 pounds heavier than I am now on stage. But I lost weight and it was hard. But either way, I remember post-show, there was a bunch of like all these fast food places like you wanted to hit up. Jack in the Box, like especially comes to mind. And I remember that for me, because I started this sport a little bit earlier, and it was moderate to severe orthorexia at times where legitimately it was like the 10 foods that work. But I got it to the place where I was pretty content with the way my life was, It's like, all right, in the morning I have spinach and I had more eggs as I need to gain more weight, maybe some fruit. And it was just this routine of foods that I thoroughly enjoyed. And, they all felt like little W's that I crossed off as I went on through the day. So I remember post-show, mind you, I was still pretty fat by stage standards. I was like, I'm supposed to go to IHOP? I'm like, I never have IHOP. Like I had IHOP. I had a few things that other bodybuilders were having, like Reese's cups and stuff like that. And it was so out of touch to me, because like these were my habits. Not to say they were perfect, but I had the routine thing. I couldn't tell you exactly why I was doing it, but it kind of served as a guardrail of sorts. I just couldn't wait to get back because I killed myself to get into like subpar shape at the end. Actually, at a certain point, I made it to this body weight at a later show, and afterwards, I'm like, man, I just can't wait to have rice again. Like that's going to be fun, and to have carbs pre-training. But for you, it was different because you had a little bit more of a gamer background still, so you still kind of had, you still had fast food more regularly than me. And when I look at like your
to give people a little bit of context as to what my off-season eating looked like, I was being told by magazines and online sources that my off season, I should be maybe 240 eventually, because I'm going to be dieting down to 220 if I'm a 6 foot, even natural competitor. And I was a hard gainer, quote unquote, being skinny. I was an ectomorph, quote unquote, being skinny. The feedback was you need to get bigger. So and then the only other information was the only thing that matters is macros. So the structure that I had, it went from eat everything to eat everything and hit these numbers. So there was so the only time I actually started instituting your typical bodybuilder in-season foods was in contest prep. So it was a very large departure from me going, yeah, I'm going to eat 6 whole eggs in breakfast, or I'll make a shake, but it's a weight gainer shake. So I had very much this, I didn't have those same skills or those same habits developed. So contest prep for me, eventually, with how restrictive and how much I tried to lose and how aggressive I was, everything about it felt like it was a stressful and a departure from my habits for context. So anyway, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, and like for me, I remember I stopped drinking soda when I was 14. I think between the ages of 16 when I got into bodybuilding and stage, I think I had eaten fast food like 5 times. Like I just didn't do those things. You know, I was very happy with this like culture that I had adopted. And I guess like fast forward to now, it's like what you have for breakfast. Like you enjoy an omelet with vegetables. Like it's so different compared to the Eric of like, that's what you have in the off season when you are at your heaviest. You will have things that are similar to that. Maybe some toast, some juice perhaps. But I think that it's like you have to, I guess the way I look at the default diet, it's kind of like your base Christmas tree, right? And, you know, over time as you get a bigger budget, it's like, oh, let's add some ornaments. And then like eventually let's get some gifts. So eventually let's get some really big gifts. And you kind of expand from there. And when times are tough, like you take away ornaments, you don't get as many gifts. And it kind of just fluctuates in that direction. So eventually, like it just gets to the point where regardless of, of how lean you're getting, there is still some semblance. I think with experienced competitors, I can look at what they do deep into a contest prep, and you can almost like guess and retrace things backwards. And it's little things that you just know. It's like, oh, maybe from cream or rice, maybe he's using some oatmeal in the off season because, there's some fat and carbs attached. Right. And you can just kind of retrace things and have a generally like good estimate, like doing some like real like in vivo archaeology here and guess like what their life is like, or reverse, because like what it would be like after their diet. But yeah, it gets to the point where, I don't know, contest prep is, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's a path like through some weeds that you've walked through like over and over and over and over. And it's so much harder to get lost in both instances, like on the way down, but I think especially on the way up when you are feeling, I guess, really primal, you should say, when it comes to what every cell in your body is telling you at that point.
And I think the big issue for many in the era that I came up in who didn't necessarily have a bodybuilding lifestyle ingrained, or the version of the bodybuilding lifestyle, like you could find those things. Like I had oats in my weight gainer at breakfast, and then, I had whey post-workout, and then I would have a chicken breast at dinner, but then it would just be like, and we're going to get pizza. And I would have tuna and rice for dinner, and then I would eat a whole thing of Haagen-Dazs because I need to gain weight. So it was this, and there were articles by like Dave Tate talking about like motivation to gain weight and like pour olive oil on your pizza, and like this is just as hardcore as your leg day. But I'm like, a skinny kid who's natural trying to push up to 220, and Dave Tate is like a super heavyweight trying to stretch out a multiply squat suit who's on, who's working with enhanced multiply powerlifter. So it's like there wasn't enough sources of information. And then the one source of information that did kind of make sense to my very analytical brain, like Lane Norton at this era or some other voices at this era were basically like, the only thing that matters is if it fits your macros. So this is, I think, a really important thing is that macros or food plans in isolation with no instruction about the other one, I think are actually quite dangerous for this outcome, because then there is not a cream of rice translates to oats situation. It is, I need to hit 10, 60, 40 at this meal. And if you take the super, super hungry primal brain that you described and you apply to that, it's like, oh goody, let me spend 14 hours figuring out what's the tastiest thing I can fit to 10 fat, 60 carbohydrates, 40 protein. And that is not structure, you know? And also, if there's no discussion of timing or structure to the day of when you do this and how you fit it around your training, and do you think about how you feel when you eat X, Y, and Z and then you go train, that can be a disaster. I remember eating a whole large pizza and then trying to train an hour later. Like that's super common sense, but I was doing that in my 07 off season, and I literally had to leave the gym. I was like, I'm gonna like vomit, burp, and diarrhea mid squat, even though I felt like good. And I was like, okay, my off season decisions are literally preventing me from training in the off season. Like I need to do something differently. So, yeah, I guess this course is something that I made for Eric Helms in 07, because I was like, I know exactly what he's missing. And maybe I'm not the only one like that. So Brad, I'd love to get your input on this and to hear your thoughts. So I'm sure your experience as getting into this in different ways and having different experience with the clients are going to be different than both Berto and I, and also with that of the athletes you coach.
Yeah, you mentioned the structure, right? Because that's one thing that I feel like a lot of competitors lack. They don't. It's like you almost like are speaking a different language to them when you tell them, "Okay, I just want you to go out and eat like a normal person, and eat 3 square meals," and they're like, "Well, what does that mean? How many macros should I have, in those meals?" And I'm like, "Just go eat 3 square meals. Eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner." Well, how much protein should I be having? And that's the default diet. When I originally read the blog, that was kind of what was speaking to me more than anything, was the structure. You can get low days, high days, off season. You can make all that fit into whatever your structure fits for your life. And we talked off air just beforehand. I really like it when I hear people say, "Yeah, you know what, Coach, how does it sound if I just eat my same structure, but, have different or similar foods, because I'm kind of tired of these foods?" And I'm like, yeah, that sounds great, And not that I don't like it when they say, "Okay, Coach, what are my macros now that I'm in recovery diet," right? I mean, I'm fine with that. And some people actually get a lot of enjoyment, in tracking their macros. But I make sure that I tell them, look, here's the important thing. Here's your macros. But what I really want you to focus on is however it is that you've been eating, if it's 3 meals and 2 snacks or however, I want you to kind of try to eat the same way. And then at the end of the day, if you end up hitting these macros, great, good job, But at the same time, I don't want you stressing over how am I going to fit 5 fat, 40 carbs, and, sometimes 50 protein into this last meal in order to get these macros. Get something that looks like that, and then let the numbers lie where they may, because it's really that structure that's important. And having taken all of this and applied it to myself, I mean, I basically went through prep and lost 15 pounds, and I didn't really even target any macros. I just kind of made sure I was hungry. I stuck to the same structure. In order to keep my calories low, I just, instead of having, 2 eggs and, 300 grams of egg whites for breakfast, I had 1 egg and 300 grams. And then later on, I took the egg away, just had 325 grams of egg whites. Instead of having peanut butter in my oatmeal, well, I had no peanut butter, in my oatmeal. And things like this are kind of what I was doing to diet down. And it was super successful. I mean, I never had one target other than make sure you get, your body weight in grams of protein, and now since I had to flip that, life got really chaotic and I couldn't even really think about calories, kind of much less all of these different variables that were going to take place. I just stuck to the same structure, and lo and behold, here it is. I've only gained like 3 or 4 pounds. And I don't even really know what that is because I just know I look the same. I'm going to guess that I've gained 3 or 4 pounds because I feel better. I'm not really hungry anymore, intentionally, and I'm performing a little bit better in the gym. But life doesn't look that much different. I have the same breakfast at the same time of day every day. 3, 4, 5 hours later, I have the same basic meal after that, and la da 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 right on down the road. It's been very easy. And like you were saying earlier, Eric, when you were talking about keeping it a little bit tighter in the off season, and that you feel like you could be just as strong, if not stronger. Arguably, the strongest I have ever been in my life was recovering out of my 2014 prep. When Berto and I competed at the Muscle Mayhem in 2014, I stuck to the same structure. I just was eating a little bit more, like you said off air, of what I was already eating. I was already enjoying my food. I just was eating a little bit more of it. And a year later, I did a guest posing with Jeff, and I competed at USAPL Raw Nationals. I had my best, then Wilks score ever, set 2 PRs at my lightest body weight that I had ever, competed at. And I think a lot of these tools that we're talking about are what attributed to that. It was so easy, and training was good. And I was focused more so on the process and not micromanaging the details of the process.
There's a key thing you said there. You were saying, as my life's gotten more chaotic, coaching football, doing all this stuff, I stopped tracking. I just went to my structure. And I think when you can tell that you don't have a default diet in your life, chaos doesn't breed a fallback on structure, which makes it easier, which is what you described. It breeds a explosion and a scattering of whatever things you were trying to make your structure, or that maybe a lack of structure. Then you find yourself eating fewer meals, or snacking, or stopping at fast food, or eating out at restaurants, and then at the last minute going, oh, my protein's too low, my calories are too high, like shit, what do I do? Okay, I'm just going to have some whey and then I'll eat less tomorrow. And that's a perfect example of why this is important. Because in the absence of a structure like this, when life changes or gets disturbed and the spider web tingles, it tears and it falls apart, and you're no longer catching the flies of gains. Really strange analogy that I just went with. But I think when you have the structure to rely and fall back on, you have exactly Brad's experience in which he described. Some other diagnostic ways that you can tell, do you have this in place and is it working? As a coach, when I hear a competitor say, and you echoed this, Brad, and I'll go into it more in depth right now, when they start talking about what they're looking forward to in the off season, is they're like, yeah, I don't really have any major cravings. I just want to eat more of what I'm having. I know 2 things are in place there. They're not unnecessarily restricting their food choices or being too neurotic in prep. They have a habit and process that they're falling on. And 3, they just want to eat more food, which is exactly what you should feel during prep. It's true physiological hunger, and they're a little less focused on their quote-unquote cravings or their desires to eat certain things. And it's okay if you have cravings, don't get me wrong. And sometimes even people who do have this structure, they need a few weeks of eating random donuts and shit to get back on track, and that's fine. Or you have the random day, you're like, man, I haven't thought about cookies in 5 years, but I want a cookie. And I would encourage you during the recovery phase to eat the cookie. That's totally fine. That's not what I'm getting at. It's not that you only need to eat the bodybuilding approved list. It's about the habits. And you can tell something is a habit when stress doesn't make you want to let go of it. Because if stress makes you want to let go of a habit, it's not habitual. That's not the way that works, right? So when you go through contest prep, and this may take time, and I mean multiple seasons, it did for me, And you think you've got this nicely ingrained habitual structure to your eating. You had it in the off season, you have it in prep. And towards the end of prep, you want to let go of not just the foods, but the entire structure of eating feels stressful, or the process that you go through. When the process that you think is a habit gets blown out of the water, it wasn't a habit. And that's essentially why it's important to try to establish these behaviors. And I think, Berto, to go back to you, like we have all these distinct courses. We have prep positioning, we have sustainable fat loss, we have the default diet, we have the recovery diet, but a lot of them carry the same through thread. So for example, in prep positioning, the argument you have for it is not some metabolic magic and, hey, you're going to lose body fat better at the lower end of your intervention point, wave my hands. It's, I want to develop the right skills for you and start at the right place to set you up for success. And this is just kind of saying the same thing as we exit prep or the fat loss phase for the non-competitors. So I want to talk to you about this. Is this something that you also intentionally focus on when you've got someone who has not yet competed, and or especially even first-timers, and you talk about, like, listen, I want to make sure you get the checklist of a person who is ready to do a prep, who is ready to compete, establishing something that resembles or accomplishes what we're talking about is part of that. Am I right?
Yeah, and usually the best time to do that is in a controlled off season. That is when your hunger cues are going to be the most manageable, and they're going to interfere a little bit less with your decision making. So in the off season, that's when you kind of design the bodybuilding eating life that you want, that fits you. And everyone's going to start at a slightly different place. Like if you grew up in a food desert, like where you guys just ate things out boxes, it's like, all right, we're going to have to start figuring out some fruits that work out for you, some vegetables that work, because those are going to be really important when we do decide to cut down. But you have to develop a taste for this. And, the variety doesn't have to be super huge at first, because some people absolutely, like, that is where they start. They can't tolerate a whole lot more than, oatmeal and whey protein, really. And the rest of this life is just like ultra demanding. As a matter of fact, I will have people who are so new to training that we get those. And I think that I take that as a compliment when we get someone who's like 6 months into training. Well, maybe that's the most consecutive training they've had, and they've never really followed anything structured. And all we're really focusing on is like, hey, let's stop our day and eat lean protein 3 times a day. Let's have 3 servings of fruit. Let's have 3 servings of vegetable. It's not going to be perfect all the time. And this is what I tell them when it comes to the diet. It's like, imagine if you would have done this for the last 10 years, just not restricting, just including these things. Do you think you'd be in better shape right now? This sounds so simple. Like, they're coming to me like, all right, hit me up with that diet. If you got to menu me up, I'm ready for that. And it's like, no, let's start here, because we have to make it so that eventually, like, this is like your lowest level of skill. Like, I think on our worst day, this is kind of sort of what we all kind of default to here, more or less, right? At least chronically, right? Might have a day or two without a piece of fruit or veg, but for the most part, it feels weird if I go more than a day or two without like either one of those. So yeah, to a large extent, the last leg of customization is going to be the athlete. You kind of set the parameters for them. You work with the skills they have. And over time, just like we try many different squat patterns for them, it's like we try many different fruits and vegetables. And like, to me, Eric, this is like another sign, and this is maybe outside of the contest prep realm, usually. But this is especially a feeling that I have after I go out and I eat something that I was craving. So the other day I was craving, I'm like, you know what? I want a really good burger. Those kind of burgers that don't stay together, tomato everywhere. I want me one of those. So I went to go have one of those. And by the end of the meal, I was like, man, part of me is like, this is good, but my everyday foods, like, I can't wait for like my next more tamed meal. I can't wait to wake up the next day and have some kiwis, an apple, and some eggs, So when, you deviate,
it's like
and you
a
miss,
vacation. when you have a job you hate, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Like for me, I love my job. I love getting back to the things we do at 3D Muscle Journey, the things I do at Mass, and working with my students. The vacation's cool, but I am absolutely thinking about but I want to get back to life, where I'm doing things that have meaning for me. This is a fantastic, and I'm an ambitious person. Some of this is wiring, and I'm not trying to judge anyone who doesn't think like I do, but at least I think a lot of bodybuilders probably are similar. But yeah, like when I take a vacation, it's a nice time to do play. But I have a reason why I do what I do, and I want to get back to it eventually. However, if I stayed in the Air Force, and no offense to any service members, my personal experience, it was not fulfilling. I didn't feel like I was contributing to something. It didn't drive my soul forward, if you will. Yeah, I would have can I get another vacation after the vacation? Because so if you hate your job, a vacation is the thing you look forward to, and you're trying to slog through, work, right? And if you love your job, you might need a vacation because we always need some R&R. We want to do some things. You got to switch it up, just like that burger. But when you get back to, a vocation or a job or a passion you love, it can burn you out. Don't get me wrong. It can create stress, and it's not easy. Being self-employed is a great way to lose work-life balance. So as much as I love Ronnie Coleman, him saying, you know what? You got a job you love, you never work a day in your life. It's not true, but there's an element of truth to it. But man, the vacations that's why sometimes people don't take them when they're self-employed. So anyway, just to kind of boost your point, but to help people assess, I think that's a good analogy as well.
No, that's exactly right. And even with prep, man, the longer you do this, the less you sweat it. Like, you've seen more cycles of okay, well, this is a poor Christmas tree. We just have a little Charlie Brown tree. And then you've seen that tree expand, and it's just another season, I live in a place where there's seasons, and it's okay, well, it's snowing today, but eventually it'll be too hot and I'll be complaining about that. But it's just, it kind of it connects the continuum that is your bodybuilding career. You don't feel like you're doing one thing that's more important than the other. They all are. It kind of just mixes it. It's a part of the exact same thing at the end. But yeah, no, that's exactly what I feel. Even when I go on vacation, Eric, same deal. If anything, I use it to give me. I can't help but think about bodybuilding. We'll be out somewhere for a weekend, and I enjoyed this vacation. It freed up a lot of bandwidth in my brain to think about ideas that can help others or myself quite often, right? But yeah, man, none of this. I think I don't realize it until I'm with a group of other folks for extended periods of time, just how much of, I guess, certain things I do, it's man, you are a whack job, bro. And a lot of people like to think of me as a kind of a more type B sort of bodybuilder, that dude just shave the sideburns hippie, bro. What are you doing, right? But when I'm around normal folks, and they're you're so disciplined, and it's this is just a reflex. I don't know that, I don't even realize these are my hands that are putting this food in my mouth, or the sense of urgency that I have, making sure I have enough fruits to last me the whole stay at this place. So eventually it gets quite passive, but it only gets passive if again, you don't skip levels. A lot of this is not skipping levels, kind of weights. You don't go from 3 plates to 4 plates in the same workout. That's going to set you back. And the same thing with your default diet. Again, that recommendation that I've used on certain athletes, where it's hey, this is all I'm asking from you from a dietary standpoint, and we're going to let the training carry us the rest of the way.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like how you started with saying, hey, in many cases it makes more sense, especially for non-competitors, but even for many competitors or aspiring competitors, to start from the off season, because the big thing they need is to create that structure, and they don't have it. I think I could have greatly benefited from that, looking back. But the funny thing was, because I didn't have it, I learned structure through prep, couldn't maintain it, and it took me 3 seasons before I was able to take the skill that most people learn in the off season to then translate it to, from prep to the off season, and find that ability to transition between the two. So I think it does depend on which angle you're coming from. It's probably a big difference between, did you Were you someone who was overweight and came to bodybuilding? Or were you someone who was skinny and underweight? What era did you come up in? Who were your influences? Or is your first exposure to If It Fits Your Macros working with 3DMJ? Or was that what you were doing exclusively, and then you came to 3DMJ, and now we start talking about meals and stuff, and you're like, oh. One of the way I like to really communicate it to athletes is talking about the plate. Like, what does the plate look like? Dr. Joe would call it like the anchor meal. Like, you have a lean protein, you have a vegetable, you have a carb source. Like, that's kind of his thing. And it's the same concept, that it's getting you kind of a more practical, real world, through like, look at the foods on a plate idea of what this looks like. I really like the athlete's plate. It's been like a published version of my plate, but for athletes. And there's like a dieting or low training or off training day, a moderate training day or a hard training day. And I try to tell them like, hey, like your hunger levels, as Brad was talking about, might dictate the height and the portion size of these things. Your phase is going to dictate how much of it's vegetables and how much of it is carbohydrates, and also how lean that protein is. And then whether you're cooking with spray or cooking with a little more added fats, or whether there's fat included in that, all these things. And is that water or a Diet Coke sitting next to you? Or if you're, someone who has a pretty high energy expenditure, is that orange juice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, and then are you going to have a dessert, like some kind of option that is bodybuilder friendly to just, okay, cool, I could fit a little more in and I need to. Just depends on the individual, but the experience, the qualitative experience of the plate and what it looks like is what they need to understand, because they're thinking either meal plan or macros and they don't know how to marry the two. So I find really sitting down and focusing and just teaching somebody, what should your plate look like each time you have control over, or even something similar to when you go to a restaurant, that can really be the thing that clicks for people. I've found that is sometimes the instructional approach that is really useful. And Brad, that's something, when we had the recovery diet and we all talked about it as a group, and you talked about having 3 square meals, you went through what is a square meal. And you're like, listen, you have a baked potato, you have a steak, and you have a side of vegetables. And it's like, I think sometimes that level of what people might perceive as hand-holding is actually really important if the athlete's background is not one of the kind of structure we're talking about, or has been in this heavily influenced by If It Fits Your Macros, and they're basically constantly watching to see what new crazy diet food comes out that they can fit into these numbers. And if their only structure is 3 numbers, and the number of meals per day changes, sometimes you'll get, at best, all they do is make sure that each time they eat, there's a protein source. And I think that probably doesn't cut it if you want to have a little more resilience. And I can't tell you how many people who follow If It Fits Your Macros think they do flexible dieting, but they blow up in the off season. They're a lightweight competitor, but they're 40 pounds over stage weight every time, despite the fact that they're hashtag evidence-based. And I think this is often, not always, but often the issue. So I don't know how you feel about that, Brett.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny. It was my transition from menu approach to eating to It Fits Your Macros that brought me to the conclusion that, okay, these 3 numbers basically represent, kind of my plate in a way. If it says that it's got 45 grams of protein, for me at a menu, it was like, okay, well, you know what, 45 grams of protein, that's my meal replacement shake. And then through being introduced to If It Fits Your Macros, it's like, oh, well, you know what, 45 grams of protein is either my meal replacement shake, or, it's 6.5 ounces of chicken breast, or, it's a serving and a half of Greek yogurt. And it helped me identify the variability of my plate that I was now exposed to. And it was less of that micromanaging of the I have to have so many meal replacement shakes to get me through the month or get me through the 2 weeks or whatever. Well, I didn't have to do that. I could just basically get that number, transfer it into the protein source that I needed. And then, of course, the other two just followed suit when it came to fat and when it came to carbs and, and kind of things like that. And usually when you're deep in the off season, at least the way that I kind of tend to approach things is, as you're looking at that plate, it might dwindle down to where, that there's not much fats, or what fats are there are the trace amount of fats in the bread that you're having with your tuna sandwich, or something like that. and the tuna is got mustard instead of mayonnaise, things like that. But the plate still looks the same. It's just that number of fats are coming from foods that have the most closely related zero to that particular number. And then, of course, in the off season, I came to the conclusion of, oh, well, you know what? Now I don't have to necessarily just throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, from now on with that meal, I'm just going to have whatever insert food craving that goes there, and I'm going to eat as much of it as I can, right? Well, you know what? You can kind of make that one of your meals one time, but at the same time, it's like, let's keep the structure of the other meals, kind of still in place. Let's have, like I said before, a couple of eggs with that egg white. There's where that fat number just came up there. Or, protein and fat, low carbs, I can have something else in there. I can have a little bit of, with your Greek yogurt, if you have fat-free Greek yogurt, you can have the more full-fat Greek yogurt. Or the one that I used to love, Eric, when you introduced me to ricotta cheese. So we have the fat-free ricotta cheese, right? A little bit of carbs, a lot of protein. Guess what? Now I can have this 2% ricotta cheese, which had a little bit more fat into it. It made that plate kind of more complete, but it was in kind of one container in a way, And if I wanted to make those carbs a little bit more, you could have a little bit more of a carb source in it or whatever. But it was kind of through that reverse engineering that I kind of learned about, the idea and the picture of what the plate should look like, without having to really sacrifice and avoid certain foods in the off season.
Yeah, it's kind of tragic that the If It Fits Your Macros and meal plan crowd got into this, like the bitter butter battle, for those who are familiar with Dr. Seuss, and it's like everything them is bad, everything us is good. Because as you can see from just your experiential description of what you went through, Brad, understanding macros works synergistically with having a backbone of a habitual meal plan. And it just gives you more options, and it enables you to look at a meal plan differently instead of thinking there's something magic about eating at these times or the foods that I've selected, but more of, now I can plug and play, which is an essential skill that enables you to not be stressed when you go to a restaurant or when you travel and you have to go to a different grocery store, maybe even in a different country, because you're like, but I know that just because they don't have chicken breast here, that I can fit in X, Y, or Z. Or I know just because they don't have the exact same carb sources that I can fit in this fruit or this or that, So those tools are just, you can get there with just If It Fits Your Macros. Like if you just have If It Fits Your Macros, there's some pros. Like you're good traveling, you just need to be able to read the food label. Hopefully it's in something close enough to English where you can just, lipides. Okay, that's fats, right? But like if you only have a meal plan structure without macros, traveling, holidays, stress, people visiting, that's rough. And that was what we were kind of fighting against. But I think we never acknowledged that when you have just numbers and you don't have a meal plan, that you never quite actually develop habits. I remember when I used to go hang out with Berto off-season 08, each meal we would just go take a trip to the grocery store and I'd figure out, let me find some new things to fit into my meals for the day. And it was this exciting thing. And it's like, you shouldn't be like window shopping every day for eating. Like, when are you developing a skill set? Like, that's a good skill set to have when you do not have meals with you and you get to a new place. Like day one of arriving in a place that you're traveling to and you're going to stay in a hotel for a while. Yeah, you should experience that. You see what they have because you have these skills, you get what you need, and then you create your default diet for that week or the equivalent of it in the local cuisine and grocery stores that are available, right? With or without having, in your room, possibly a microwave or possibly a fridge. And like, okay, well, I don't have a fridge, I don't have a microwave. We're kind of moteling it for 3 days. So that's rice cakes, that's packets of tuna. It might be, I know Andrea likes beef jerky. There's a lot of different options, I'm going to get some eggs. I'm going to hard boil them if I have an option. Maybe you don't have the ability to boil water, but you make various different decisions based upon what's available to you to create the structure that also has an appropriate amount of numbers. But as Berto was mentioning, you may be at a point where the structure is far more important to learn right now than the numbers, and that's a step down the track. And let's just create the structure. Here's what a plate looks like. Repeat that 3 times per day. Eat till you feel satisfied and have some whey protein post-training. Take some creatine and let's work on your training. And then 6 months from now, 3 months from now, 2 months from now, whatever your learning curve is, let's start talking about the numbers that are coming from these plates. Let's do a bit of an audit. Let me look over your shoulder. And we'll go, okay, how many calories are you habitually eating? Okay, what is that doing to your body weight? Okay, it's stalled. And that's probably because we need to be a little more intentional here. What are some things we can plug and play? All right, so that low-fat dairy, like Brad was saying, becomes full-fat dairy. All right, these chicken breasts and this tuna, well, maybe becomes albacore or salmon or chicken thigh or steak. Okay, so we've got these carb sources that are relatively lean. You're doing a lot of tubers. Let's switch it to rice. Now we're getting a few more carbohydrates per portion of the plate. So you can't do that until you understand both sides to this. But the point is that the whole time when you approach it this way, when you start with, let me just have a plate and let me have this structure to the day, and then I'm going to add on these other skill sets, and you're not skipping levels like Berto was saying, it's time spent ingraining these habits. And then if and when you do go through a relatively intensive fat loss phase, that structure is maintained. And then when you go into a maintenance phase or a gaining phase, depending upon how lean you got at the end of that phase, so both competitors and non-competitors can benefit from this concept, that's when you decide to maintain the structure and just plug and play different things. So you can plug and play from your low day to a refeed by just adding carbohydrates, swapping vegetables for carbs, swapping out low-calorie fruits for high-calorie fruits, increasing portion sizes of the same things. Then you can move from a refeed to the off-season of the recovery diet just by adding those fats and even more carbohydrates. So it's relatively straightforward. Or you can leave your diet the same and just cut your steps and not do cardio, So all of these things, what you want to get to is that it feels qualitatively the same and it fits within a structure and it's not a stress to make the modifications. And the rubric, the litmus test is always, is the stress in the system making me want to abandon the structure? Because then it's still not ingrained, it's still not habitual. And as a coach, what we can do is make sure that we don't put you in a position to where you're trying something that's going to be the highest stress possible, a contest prep, at least as far as the dieting world is concerned, before those actually are true habits. And that's something we have to diagnose. And we also need you have to be honest with yourself. Is this something that you've only been doing it for a year and the whole bodybuilding experience is this crazy new world and you feel like it's surreal, like you're lifting weights, your body's changing, you're eating this whole different way, but it's not life. And that's a beautiful, fun phase because you're attentive to every moment. It's like being a 1-year-old and you see a flower for the first time. It's like, oh my God, flower, like Dad, look at this. And you're like, I've seen that, son. I've been around the block. I know you have no concept of what it's like to be alive 30 times your age, but yes, flowers, they exist. For many experienced bodybuilders, we'll be sitting down at the, here's one for you that I know all three of us can relate to. Post-show, we go out. This might be my 4th season or my 5th season, but we're at the table invariably with some people it's their 1st or 2nd season. The decisions we make and what we order post-show and how much we eat and whether we eat off other people's plates, or even, I think a better one is like 1 month post-show. Like, what are they still doing and what are we doing? And you can kind of watch the older competitors look at the other younger competitors and just be like, yeah, you think you're having fun right now, but this is going to really cause you some issues. And just, even though we can relate to it because it wasn't that long ago for us, I feel like that's just not in me anymore. And it's largely due to these habits being built in place. I think that is another one of those litmus tests. If all of a sudden it becomes like, inner fat kid after every season for more than a few weeks, we got a problem. This is an identified thing to work on as a bodybuilder skill.
Yeah, and another litmus test is when you're at home for the first time, eating dinner with your family, and you're literally freaking out. If you're literally freaking out because of what your mom is making for dinner, or lunch or breakfast or whatever, you still got a little bit of work to do, because most moms, they're gonna prepare, food the way that we're kind of talking about. There's going to be the protein, there's going to be the carbs, and there's going to be, the fats. And, sometimes the spaghetti gets in there where you got kind of like all three of them all kind of blended together, the tomatoes and the pasta and the meats all just kind of in there, right? But there again, there's your plate, and you can try as best you can to be a little bit heavy on the meats that are in the sausage, so you can get that protein up. But at the same time, there's no reason to panic. You just, the way that I always tell my athletes is like, you know what, you don't have to eat that until you're stuffed. Mom's going to be just as happy, and sure, she's going to ask you if you want more, but you just kind of say, no, I'm good. I had my fill, and I want to just kind of leave it there, and then later on that night, like we talked about, you can make up that protein with the, a little bit of whey protein that you might have brought with you or something like that. But that's another. If my client's telling me, Coach, I'm going to need a diet break and a couple cheat days while I go back home to have my, my birthday party or my mom's birthday party or whatever. And I'm like, well, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too in this particular case if I've equipped you properly.
Absolutely. If when they can start to really think critically and flexibly about the structure of their default diet, that's really important. Like if you know that mom's going to be given, these hearty meals at 7 p.m. every night while I'm home, then you would think, okay, well, the structure of my lunch changes a little bit to be a little more bare bones on the carbs and fat, right?
Yes.
And then if I'm getting a double portion of what I would normally have as far as my fats and carbs at dinner, then all I'm having before bed is not a full plate, but it's just going to be low-fat Greek yogurt, right? And all of a sudden, bam, you're right back where you need to be. Now you're thinking not just within plate, but across plates. So that's the type of place where we want to not only have these habits ingrained, but also have you with the troubleshooting and flexibility to know how to modify them over time. And that comes with practice and also exposure. So this is where I also would question, is it a true habit if you need to be socially avoidant and to follow it? And it might be that it is a habit. It's just you're really, really bad at pivoting. And you're just not, you don't have enough practice, sticking to the big picture structure when the little picture structure is changed. But again, that's only going to happen by getting better at it. And it is the bodybuilder who is a little too small in their worldview and constrains their lives too much that struggles in those scenarios. So yeah, I think all of those things are things to self-identify or to identify as a coach and make sure you're paying attention to so that you can really put your athletes in the best position to succeed in these challenging times. And I think the biggest, most obvious challenging time is that recovery phase. And we've previously said many times that the period after the diet is harder than the contest prep itself. I would say it should be eventually. I think that's absolutely and frequently true and can be the case, but it's also indicative of a mindset or a skill set that is lacking or needs to change. So I don't at all think in my last 3 seasons that the recovery phase was harder than the prep phase. And when that is the case, these skills are lacking, or you often have a potential body image issue where you're really uncomfortable what it looks like to be even slightly over stage weight, or you become accustomed to what your stage weight looks like. And you're a little too focused on the physique changes and you're struggling with the concept of, okay, well now in the off season, it ain't gonna be looking better. Like, I'm not gonna know as someone who's at the stage where I'm actually competing, whether I've put on, an extra centimeter on my lats when I'm 15% body fat, versus 5. So maybe I should be focusing on my lat pull down performance. So it could just be that some mindset shifts need to happen. It doesn't mean you don't have the skill set. But after, I think, properly doing a few seasons the right way, or with some of these skills being developed, the recovery phase absolutely is a challenge, and it is hard, but it shouldn't be as hard as prep. And prep should be getting easier as well. And if anything, it is just navigating those transition phases, that is the period. And then there's going to be a lag time, but it should be a tapered process, I think, in many cases. But yeah, I think that's probably a revised position. I'm not sure we've ever said that on the 3DMJ podcast. I think our position previously has been, recovery phase is the hardest. And I think the recovery or the post-show period is the hardest for people who don't have these skills. Or at the very least, it's a surprise because they're expecting it to be easier because they're fixing the thing that they think has stressed them during contest prep, when in fact they realize that contest prep actually exposed the lack of skills they have. And that's what I think we're trying to step in and intervene with here, at least for the competitors, with the default diet.
And add to that the guy with the first time abs, because to him, like,
yep, it's the equivalent.
That is his recovery for yeah.
Yeah, and I think right now, kind of I'm placing myself in the seat of the listener. I'm like, okay, you know what, you guys have kind of sold me, and what I need now is the practical takeaways, and the hard part with this is that we've kind of talked about like 3 different types of people, I guess, that need the practical takeaways. We've got these people that, they are post contest. They've been shredded, right? They have these healthy relationships with food. Maybe right now this person's going, wait a minute, I shouldn't stay shredded like this, forever. And you go visit the recovery diet and find out why, you don't want to do that. But then the second person is the opposite. They're deep in their off season and like, okay, well, you know what? I'm on the seafood diet. If I see the food, I eat it, And then you've got the person that's kind of in between there, where either they want to kind of need to gain a little bit of weight, or they're kind of thinking, well, I need to kind of do a little bit of a prep positioning diet. I need to kind of get down from where I am now to, 10 to 12% above stage weight. And so, I just kind of picking at the coach's brains in both Alberto, you, and then also Eric, if we could, kind of give these 3 different people kind of some practical takeaways on how they might. We talked about identifying if they need these skills, right? But then how do I get these skills? What are the my first steps?
Well, the obvious first step is go to 3dmjvault.com and take the default diet course. Oh, the monetization is real, folks. This is big vault coming in. Well, no, but in all seriousness, actually, I think it is personally, and of course, I'd love to hear Berto's thoughts because I know he has more experience as a coach than I do these days. But in fact, all of you guys do. But I see it as the same process for all of them. It's all right if this podcast is making you feel like, oh, I don't know that I have these habits ingrained. The first step is, all right, you might actually be doing this already, but you haven't thought of it in this manner. And thinking of it in this manner may help crystallize it as a habit that you're now intentionally aware of. So actually, get out a spreadsheet if you're digitally inclined, or a Word document, or get out a pen and paper if you're analog and old school, or whatever you want. Write out what you're doing and see how you have a protein, a carb, and a fat source in each meal, and see where maybe the structure isn't there, and see what do you default to. If you're in prep, use a low day as the skeleton and build up from there. And if you're in the off season and you're kind of just following the seafood diet like Brad is, think about how you might structure it. And you can absolutely incorporate eating out. You can have like or X, Y, and Z, and then think about what would I order there. And it may be also an opportunity to start on a new set of habitual rules. Like if you are kind of just snacking and eating, and basically you just find yourself at 9 p.m. and you have 2 scoops away and go to bed, because that's what gets you from this basically non-bodybuilder-y eating process of high carbs, high fats, and then, okay, I got my protein up and all that matters is protein. Here's an opportunity to dot some I's and cross some T's. Okay, let me have at least 3 protein boluses, and I'll build meals around that. I'll actually create a plate. And it may feel like an exciting new chapter for you if you're in the off season on a seafood diet. But it also tells you probably need some time doing this before you jump into, a fat loss phase. Those are the people who struggle the most. They find themselves heavier than they want to be in the off season and dieting harder than they want to be in the in season, because they go from seafood to structure, So how can we go from the same calories you need, maybe not quite as high if you're 40 pounds over, from your seafood diet, but with structure, to then taking that same structure to lower calories, but not as low as they need to be for prep. So as they say, there's no time like the present. I think in each of these cases, it is, all right, if the structure's not there, let's write it down, let's jump in and let's play with it. And if you got a coach, talk to them. Also, if you're living with family and you're working with them, just think about that, and make sure you include them. You're not trying to create something that creates social stress or familial stress in this process. Incorporate that into your default diet. And let's say, oh, okay, actually on Fridays, my wife works late, so I'm left to my own devices. I've historically just grabbed a bunch of air pop popcorn and then had way before bed. Maybe I make that into an actual dinner. Just not that it's better necessarily from a physiological perspective, but it's better from a psychological habit building perspective, because now when my wife is home, we have dinner. And now when I'm home alone, I have dinner. So that when I go into contest prep, it doesn't feel like a change to have dinner that then I want to let go of when I go into the off season during the post-contest transition phase. So that's kind of my advice. But Berto, I wonder if you have more nuanced or different advice for those different scenarios.
And before Berto gets going too, I want to clarify just one thing and kind of mention what Eric meant versus what Eric said. Eric said that Brad is like Brad on the seafood diet right now. And I'm like, well, what he meant was Brad's not on the seafood diet, nor has Brad ever been on the seafood diet. But I was referring to the seafood diet, that Brad is on the seafood diet.
I just meant Brad's example of someone being on the seafood diet.
Example of the seafood diet. So no, I'm not on the seafood diet, and I don't know that I've ever been able to afford to be on the seafood diet, to be honest with you. So anyway, just
says
want to
the guy who ate
clarify
10,000
that.
calories purposely postseason back in 2011.
Well, that was one day.
True.
Should that be considered a diet? and I've had multiple days like that. But
yes. That's not a consistent off-season approach by any means.
Exactly. Yeah. But no, guilty as charged. I've had seafood days.
So have I, my friend. So have we all.
I feel like this podcast and the course, the people who feel that they need to try these things out the most are the least likely. They tuned out like a minute into this podcast because they're like, this is boring fundamental stuff. But the truth is, like, this goes for anything. You never stop working at when it comes to your like fundamentals and getting them better. For example, like, let's just say all I had to work with was like, it's just like, okay, you only have a barbell and you can only do a squat pattern, a hinge, a press, and a pull using this thing. All right, I'll tell you what, my physique will probably decline a bit, but my mother wouldn't be able to tell. I think the layperson when I'm out in the street wouldn't be able to tell. And I'm doing that with like the bare minimum. Eric, you shared that, okay, at this point, you've done this and you're good enough at these fundamentals that what would happen if you followed the bare minimum would get you shredded. Like you'd be shredded. That's what happens when he follows his fundamentals that he's like just sharpened and gotten better at over time. And that's why like that core is so important, because it's the core. Like the other stuff is like the 20% or so. So it's boring. Like the remedial stuff, it's hard to convince people that the majority of your results are going to come from the simplest of things. Like, again, you could add like, I don't like again, like with the person who's starting out, like it's really hard for someone who's like mostly untrained to understand. And I think most of our listeners would, that 3 servings of fruits, 3 servings of veg, fruit, do that, train hard, mostly focus on training. That'll probably give you more than like any sort of like whack job diet you've tried over like the last, 5 years or so. So yeah, the fundamentals get slept on, but as you improve those, like your game overall, like it just improves. Like if we did the barbell challenge and the default diet, we'd just be shredded with slightly smaller arms, slightly less cap delts. I guess no calves for me, right? But but it's a pretty square deal. So yeah. Again, this is one of those things that a lot of people are like, just give me the podcast that tells me how many calories I should be eating, how much volume I should use. When in reality, It's like, bro, it doesn't even start there. Like, you take care of these things, everything else will take care of itself.
Man, well said. I think we can leave it there, gents. We covered a lot of good ground. I'm pretty happy with this episode, and I really do hope that people did stick around, because this is it ain't sexy, but it's honest work kind of podcast. So, yeah, thank you all for tuning in. Coach Loomis, Coach Nunez, I greatly appreciate the insights and the color that you've added and the different ways of conceptualizing this concept so we can apply it to a broader section of our listeners. Dear listener, thank you so much. Definitely head over to 3dmjvault.com. Check out the default diet if you're interested in this, and we will see you next time.